in order to understand closures, we have to actually start with scopes. And so let me pull up my PyCharm again. So this is the same code that I had last week. Maybe I'll start with a fresh file though. Let me go ahead and create a new project here. And I'm going to call this 233Y week 2. And I'll start with the standard template, including this main.py. And let me go ahead and get rid of the comments. And in the stub for the program, you get this thing that says if under name under. This is called dunder as well for double underscore. So dunder name is double underscore name double underscore, which is equal to dunder main. Then we can execute some code. So I'll call a main function, for example. And then in the main function, let's say I'm going to set actually def main. And what I'll do is I'll set a variable called a equal to a value like some value, so a piece of text. And then I'll print a. And then let me go ahead and from main, I'll call a subfunction. And then inside my subfunction, I'm going to also print a. So, and then I'm going to be PEP 8 compliant. So I'll get rid of all the warnings. And then you'll notice that a has a little, maybe you can see this and maybe you can't, but there's a little red curly line under this a here. And if I hover over it, it says unresolved reference a. So anyone want to take a guess why I have that error there?
Because you didn't pass any parameters.
Yeah, because I didn't pass in a as a parameter, and there's basically no reference to a anywhere. So in the chat, it's because we didn't pass in the value. Exactly right. So what's really going on one step down is that Python has various namespaces. So a namespace is like a dictionary, and we'll talk more about namespaces next week when we start talking about objects and classes. But a namespace is basically like a dictionary, and it has a mapping from a key, like the name A, to a value, like a piece of text or a number or whatever. And so like if I'm in Python, let me go ahead and get a Python interpreter here. And then if I make a dictionary, like let's say G for global is equal to a dictionary. And then I say G square bracket A square bracket is equal to some value. And then I print G, you'll see that there's a key, the string A, which is the name of a variable, and a value, which is some value. So this is just like what we looked at last time with keyword arguments. So if I defined a function like a function, and then it has star star KW args, and then I print KW args in here, and then I call that a function, and I pass in a equals some value. See, what gets printed is actually a dictionary with a key being a string, which is the name of a variable. And this value here is going to be the value of the variable. So just like what I did manually here when I created this dictionary, that's what I get when I call this function and I pass in a keyword argument. And that's also the same kind of thing you get with a namespace. So you have for keys, you have names of variables, and then for values, you have any kind of Python thing. So this could be a number, could be a whole number, it could be a floating point number, it could be a big num, could be a piece of text, could be an object, and all the different kinds of objects there are. Any value that's a legal value. It could even be none, which is a no value value, or the Boolean values true or false. Could be any of those things. Now, the key here, though, is understanding that Python has different namespaces. And each namespace is going to be associated with something called a scope. And a scope is basically, it's a starting point and an ending point where a namespace is active. So if I go ahead and define A is a default value, then what I'm doing here is, you'll notice this is not inside of any function. There's a scope that all of the code belongs to, called the global scope. And when I define A equal a default value, that's actually creating a new variable called A, and a different scope called a module level scope. So there's a global scope that all my modules live in, and then each module has its own scope, which starts at the start of the file and ends at the end of the file. And if I add a variable to the namespace for the module scope, you'll notice that this doesn't have a curly red line under it anymore, because now this function is defined inside of the module scope. And so when I refer to A is going to match this A in the module scope, and I'll get that value. So if I run this code, so this thing here, this prints some value as the value of A. And then this thing here prints a default value as the value for A. So these are actually two different variables named A. This variable named A lives in a namespace that belongs to the scope of this function. So functions have their own scope. Every time you define a function, there's a scope that's created from this def line, and it ends when you return from the function. So that's a scope that only exists while this function is being executed. And then inside of that scope, you have a namespace where you can define variables that are local to the function. So this thing here, A equals some value, that's a variable that's local to the scope for this main function. Whereas this A here, there's a scope for this subfunction here, but there's no A variable defined inside of it. So when we look for the value of A, first we check for local variables named A in this scope, and there isn't one. So then we look in the outer scope for the module, and here we find an A. So this is the one that we end up using. And if there wasn't one here, then we would look in the global scope that all of the modules live in. Okay, but we do actually find it. And so that's the value that ends up getting printed. And so that's why this first print statement here is printing A inside of the scope of main. The second one, it's printing A on the module level scope because there is no local variable named A. So let me go ahead and add one, local value. And then if I run the code again, so now you'll see that some value is the same, but now it prints a local value instead of printing the default value. So we were talking about scopes and what was happening here. So when I added a variable A to the scope of the function subfunction, this A became the same A as inside this scope. Without it, this A is going to refer to the A in the outer scope, And if I got rid of this, it would look in the global scope, but there is no A in the global scope either here. And so if I just run this, I'm going to get an error that A is not defined. Actually, I have to exit this thing first, and then I can run this. Yeah, so I get the error name A is not defined because it's not in the global scope.